Well, thank you so much, Wahid. It is a real privilege to be with you all this afternoon. It seems a long journey, actually, because in 1984 to 85, I traveled weekly from London to Birmingham to do my first studies of Islam. I was training to be a rabbi, and I went every Tuesday to study at the what was then called the Center for Muslim Christian Relations at the Selliat Colleges. In fact, I think it might even have been in the current Al-Mahdi building. And my first teacher of Arabic at that time was Bert Briner, and I had a wonderful Quran teacher, Hassan Askari, peace be upon him. Fond memories of that time. And more recently, my wife and I have benefited from the Arabic teaching of Nazmina Danji, who is one of your lecturers at Al-Mahdi. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to give a brief general introduction to the topic, about 5 minutes, and then I'll talk for about 15 minutes on the creation story at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible in Genesis, and then I'll devote the rest of my time to sharing a few texts about environmental concerns. When Jews, Christians, and Muslims meet to discuss the topic of creation, we already have a shared tradition behind us, much older than our modern interfaith dialogue. In the great ages of medieval philosophical speculation, our three faiths on occasion debated with each other openly, but more often, I think, simply read each other's books and used them as influences for their own ideas about philosophy, theology, the nature of God, and the nature of creation. Sarah Strumza has written about this in her book Andalus and Safarad, and I'm going to give you a very brief quotation of what she says. Philosophers in Al-Andalus truly shared a common tradition. Jews and Muslims alike read scientific and philosophical works translated from Greek into Arabic, as well as books by earlier Muslim and Christian thinkers. Moreover, the main language of philosophical expression for Jews was Arabic. Being a small minority within their religious communities and sharing the same education, interests, concerns, and ideals, philosophers had, in a way, a subculture of their own. While they lived fully within their own faiths, they were acutely aware of what they had in common. The affinity between true philosophers could override differences of religious affiliations. Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could recreate that atmosphere of Al-Andalus this afternoon? I think one question, important one, that's been asked in all our three faiths about the nature of creation is this. Was God's creation made from some kind of pre-existing substance, or was it made out of nothing? For which philosophers tend to use the Latin term creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. It's a question that's been asked since the era of the pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece, who tended to reject the idea. They thought, on the whole, that the world was made out of something, as it were, which perhaps had always been there. And then there's a connected but separate question, which is this. Were heaven and earth the first things to be created, or was something created beforehand? And all our three faiths have different answers, I think, to this. Predating the text from our rabbis is the beginning of John's Gospel, in which the world begins with the Logos, the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Though actually the Greek text says text at the end says, God was the Word. But the King James Bible, which we're familiar with, put it the other way round. The Word was God. It was perhaps in response to this that our rabbis began to teach that the Torah existed before creation. You can find that in a 4th century Midrash. By 4th century, I mean the 4th century of the Christian era. Bereshit Rabbah, a book which often responded to Christian theological claims. It says that 2 things preceded the creation of the world: the Torah and the throne of God's glory. Much later, in Spain, the discussion was taken up by Ramban, Moses Nachmanides, who lived from the 1190s to around 1270. And he wrote this in the introduction to his Torah commentary. Moses wrote himself into the Torah in the 3rd person. The reason the Torah was written in this way is that its existence preceded the creation of the world. And by that time, many Muslim theologians were teaching that the Quran existed before creation. These ideas of the Logos, the Torah, the Quran, and indeed, of course, God existing before the creation of matter, they're not necessarily in opposition to the idea of creation out of nothing, but some thinkers thought there were. Let me mention very briefly one of the most important figures in the history of Jewish-Muslim relations, Sa'adia Gaon, Sa'id al-Fayyumi, who was born in Fayoum in Upper Egypt towards the end of the 800s. He lived his adult life in Babylonia, now Iraq. In his readings of the Jewish Bible, which he put in his book of Beliefs and Opinions, he talked about creation out of nothing. And he both responded to and reflected Islamic and Christian theological claims. So that's my brief introduction, and I'm now going to start looking at the very first verse of our Bible, the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the Hebrew, and I put the transliteration under each word, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. There's a lot of baits and alepphs in this verse, the first 2 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, or aleph bet as we call it. This sentence consists of 7 words, and in mystical speculation, each letter of the Hebrew alphabet can be given a number, aleph 1, bet 2, and so on. Using this system, the letters with the spellings we have in our verse add up to the number 777. The first 3 words have 14 letters in total, that's 2 sevens. The second 4 words also have 14. The 4th and 5th words consist of 7 letters, and the last 2 words also consist between them of 7 letters. This emphasis on the number 7 might suggest that this creation account was written to explain the 7th day, the Shabbat, the day of rest. In the Zohar, the great Jewish mystical work which appeared out of nowhere in 13th century Spain, all the letters of the alphabet joined together, coming before God and wanting to be the first word in the Torah, or as they put it, may the world be created through me. And God kind of interviews them all, starting with the last letter, the Taf, and rejecting each one until Bet, the second letter in the alphabet, came along. And God said, yes, you can begin creation. And the letter Aleph, to the letter Aleph, he said, because I'm not choosing you, you'll have the honor of being the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There's other strange things about the letters here as well. You notice that the first two words begin with the same letters. Hebrew reads from right to left, and they both begin with a bet resh aleph. And then the next two words begin with the aleph. Bereshit, the root is rosh, which means ahead. Ber means in, and sheet is a grammatical ending. Bereshit means in the beginning of. In the beginning of what? Arabic grammarians would say it's in idafa, mudaf, but there's no noun after it. It's, in a way, ungrammatical. There's a verb after it. And this has been taken up by modern translators. When, for example, you read the most modern Jewish translation, the NJPS translation, it says this: when God began to create heaven and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light." All one sentence in that translation. Interesting, if you translate it like that, it doesn't say anything about the beginning really at all. It's just saying, at this point in time, when the creation of heaven and earth began, this is what happened. There might be something before that, but the Torah in this interpretation doesn't tell us. If, however, you translate it with the transitional translation in the beginning, then this, I think, is intended to indicate the beginning of everything as far back as we can possibly speculate. So that's Bereshit, and then we come on to Bara, which means he created. That might well indicate made out of nothing. When we look at the oldest translation of this, which is the Septuagint, the translation into Greek made by Jews around 200 years before the Christian era, we find, however, that the Greek didn't use created, it used made, which could indicate made from something. Our third word is Elohim. Elohim means God, but grammatically the im ending indicates a plural. However, it's not a plural because the noun with it is singular. You can't put plural nouns with singular verbs in Hebrew, at least only very rarely. The commentator Ibn Ezra, the wandering scholar, he lived from around 1092 to 1160s, born in Spain, spent his life wandering around Europe, came to England, and may even have died in Oxford or in London. So he suggested that this plural form is standard. One who is lower refers to one who is higher by using a plural form, and in Arabic, the great refer to themselves by using the plural Elohim and Adonai. Sorry, the great refer to themselves by using the plural. Elohim is an example. Adonai, in the way we read it, is another example. And then we have this strange little word, et. Et in Hebrew is the marker of the object of a sentence, an accusative marker. The accusative endings having all but disappeared from classical Hebrew. Actually, there is an accusative ending you could use. The word shamaima does come in the Bible, but it means to heaven. It's taken on a towards function. And equally, artsa, to earth. But to use it as the object of a sentence, you need the word et. Rabbi Akiva, who thought everything in the Bible, even the little letter et, had to be explained, said that this et in this sentence does indeed indicate an object marker, because without it you couldn't tell. You might think that Shamayim and Haaretz, the heaven and the earth, were part of the subject of the verb. God, heaven and earth did the creating. So he said the et is important. Coming on to the word for heaven, Hashamayim. Now this ayin ending is a Hebrew dual, as if there were two heavens. Perhaps that was the original idea. It's always written in the dual form. Rabbi Yosef Bar Hanina said this word is actually an acronym. Sheshamayim, meaning water is there. Others said it meant Eish Umayim, fire and water, teaching that God combined them together and made the heavens from them. And finally, Haaretz. Now, the Ha in Hashamayim and Haaretz is the Hebrew definite article, the. And here the word is Eretz, but with the Ha in front it becomes Haaretz. And Ibn Ezra said this is very unusual. No other word acts quite like this. Eretz is a multifaceted word. It can mean a land, a country, but here it clearly means planet Earth, insofar as the ancients had any conception of that. So that's our first sentence in Genesis. And we're now going to have a very quick look at some translations of that sentence, which give a slightly different tone and perhaps meaning. The oldest we have is the Septuagint, from perhaps the 2nd century before the Christian era, where it's translated en arche epoiesin ha theos ton uranon kaiten gain. In beginning made the God, the heaven, and the earth. Pretty literal translation. Apart from this word made, as I mentioned earlier, why not create? Well, I'm not sure there is actually a proper classical Greek term for created. Words for create in Greek tend to be verbs like tikto, meaning to give birth. And this would tie into the Greek notion that things were created by one God giving birth to another. Mother Earth giving birth to Uranus in one Greek version. So we wouldn't want that in our Bible, because we have a completely different notion of creation. So that's why such words were not used. However, the Septuagint calls this book of the Bible the book of Genesis, which indeed actually literally does mean birth. Coming on to Aramaic. Vakadmin vara Hashem yat Shemaya vayat ara. This is from Targum Onkelos, early 2nd century of the Christian era. Well, that's a pretty literal translation, except for the first word, where it says of old, kadmin, rather than in the beginning. Those of you who know Arabic will know the verb kadima, etc., with a very similar meaning. I've now got a Coptic Christian version in Arabic. Fi al-Badi, khalaqa Allahu as-samawati wa al-ard, which is a pretty literal translation, I think. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, this is fascinating. Saadia Gaon, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote what is called his tafsir in Judeo-Arabic, that is to say, Arabic written in Hebrew letters. And it's got no vowels here, but I think it reads awalama halaka Allahu asamati wa'ad. And that means the first thing that God created was the heaven and the earth. Now, this beginning is quite different. Saadia did believe in creation out of nothing, but he seems, by changing it from in the beginning, we can discuss it afterwards because it is fascinating. He seems to be suggesting that this wasn't necessarily, or not at all, the beginning of time. God was around long before that, but this was the first material thing that God had made. The Latin Vulgate, in principio creavit Deus caelum et terram, straightforward. It doesn't mean in principle, it means in the beginning God created heaven and earth, or the heaven and the earth. There's no definite article in Latin. And coming on to English translations, the Wycliffe Bible in the 3080s, in the beginning God made of naught heaven and earth, putting the theology into the verse there, explicitly saying that it was made out of nothing. And William Tyndale's very important translation from the 1530s, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, important because those words were used precisely by the famous King James Bible in 1611. But some modern translations take it the other way around. In the beginning, when God created the universe, is the Good News Bible, linking up the first few verses into one sentence. If I've got time, I'm going to come back at the end to talk about what happened next, particularly the seventh day. On the first day, God created the heavens and the earth. The second day, the sky and the seas. The third day, the land and plants. The fourth day, the sun, moon, and stars. The fifth day, fish and birds. And on the sixth day, the land, animals, and human beings. So now I've got a little bit of time left to talk about the environment. And I'm going to pull out, I think, 3 or 4 ideas. There are a multitude of Jewish texts on the environment. Most important one is stewardship. We are guardians to look after it. The second one, prohibition on wanton destruction or waste and preservation of species. The third, pollution. And fourth, the green belt. So stewardship begins in the next chapter of Genesis. Vayikach Adonai Elohim et ha'adam vayanichehu b'gan Eden la'ovda u'lashomora. The eternal God put Adam, the man, in the Garden of Eden to work it, to work the ground, and to take care of it, to guard it, to keep it. And this idea of guardianship is so important. And then a few verses further down, it says that Adam gave names to all the livestock. He gave names to all the birds of the air and all of the wild animals. And that's very striking because Adam is taking the job of naming over from God. God, it says, the beginning called the light day, and the darkness he called light. But now he has Adam there, God has delegated the function of naming to human beings. And there's a theology in that, I think. If we have that God-given function of giving things names, it puts us in charge, but a charge that must be exercised with huge responsibility. There are many laws in Torah about supporting the poor, and this one in particular from Leviticus, that you mustn't harvest all the way to the edges of your field, or pick up the grain you missed, or go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the fallen grapes. All those for the poor and the outsiders. And this is a God-given law. This law in particular shows that what grows is not to be seized by us simply as our personal property, that it has to be shared. For as the book of Leviticus says, the land is mine, said God. Ultimately, it is not just ours to exploit everything as we have been doing. We have a huge responsibility, and that includes our responsibility to the poor. And of course, our responsibility to the poor in our time means having a sustainable world. The book of Leviticus also gives us a sabbatical year. For 6 years, plant your fields, trim the branches in your vineyards, and gather your crops. But the seventh day must be a Sabbath for the lands. Just as the people are to have a Sabbath every week, so the land is to have its Sabbath year, when you're not meant to grow things at all, and you have to live on what grows by itself. It's a concept which used to be practiced, I think, in the Middle Ages in this country when they let fields lie fallow. But the idea that the land needs a rest, which we know scientifically that it does, has been largely forgotten in our time, and we just exploit it for everything it can produce without allowing it to have a break, as it were. And there's a very famous midrash from Ecclesiastes Rabbah, which really sums up all this section on stewardship. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what God has made crooked? When the Holy One of Blessing created the first man, God took him and led him round all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to him, "Behold my works, how beautiful and commendable they are. All that I've created, for your sake I created it. Take care that you do not corrupt and destroy my world, for if you do, there is no one who can repair it after you." And what's particularly important about that teaching is that it requires us to look at the needs of future generations. We can't just look, as human societies tend to, a few years ahead, or even less sometimes. We have to look future generations, a century ahead, even longer, and see what they are going to have. There's a famous story about a pre-rabbinic figure called Choni Hamagel, who saw a man planting a tree and said to him, "What kind of tree is it?" And he said, "It's a carob tree." And he said, "How long will it take to fruit?" He said, 70 years. And Choni rather rudely said to him, "You're an old man, you won't be around in 70 years. And he said, "I'm not planting it for myself, I'm planting it for those who come after me." So, I think that's all I'm going to say about stewardship. And I'm going to go on now to the next section about destruction and preservation. And for this, we turn to the book of Deuteronomy. Suppose you surround a city and get ready to attack it. And suppose you fight against it for a long time in order to capture it. Then don't chop its trees down and destroy them. You can eat their fruit. So don't cut them down. The trees of the field aren't people, so why attack them? Fruit-bearing trees, in other words, must not be destroyed in warfare. But this is one of the laws that the rabbinic tradition greatly extended. A 13th century list of mitzvot called Sefer HaChinuch says this: "You shall not destroy Bal Tashchit." It is included under this precept not to cause any waste, for instance, to light a fire, tear clothing, or break a vessel for no purpose. The root reason for this is to train our spirits to love what is good and beneficial, And as a result, good fortune will cling to us, and we will move away from every evil thing and every destructiveness. This is the way of the Hasidim, kindly people of piety, and the conscientiously observant. They are love, peace, and are happy at the good fortune of people and bringing them to Torah, and they will not even destroy a mustard seed in the world. And they are distressed at every ruination and spoilage that they see. And if they are able to do any rescuing, they will save anything from destruction with all their power. How our world has forgotten this, how my own generation has forgotten this. I remember well how my own parents, who lived through the Second World War, may their memories be for a blessing, how my own parents would never waste food. Every scrap had to be eaten up. And today we just throw it away wantonly. So this is about not destroying things when we don't have to, and the preservation of our species. There are lots of other laws that I don't have time to go into, but in the Talmud you can find laws about the disposal of hazardous waste, the regulation of industries causing air pollution, not killing animals for convenience, not wasting fuel, and indeed not eating extravagant foods when simpler ones will do. And even a law about not wasting clothes by burying them in the grave. It's better, read Maimonides, the great Jewish thinker from Spain who lived in Egypt. He said it's better to give clothes to the poor than to cast them to worms and moths. Whoever buries the dead in an expensive garment violates the principle of Baal Tashit, you shall not destroy. Very, very interesting text. So, finally, green spaces. There's a text in Leviticus, and it's repeated in more detail in the book of Numbers, that the grasslands around the towns and fields, they're called migrash in Hebrew, belonging to the Levites, must never be sold. They will belong to them for all time to come. Now I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for the last bit. Oh, I'm still connected. Or have I just been talking to myself?
No, you're still connected.
Oh, good. I wasn't sure for a moment. Okay, so the commentary, very interesting commentary by Samson Raphael Hirsch, who lived from 1808 to 1888 in Germany, and he wrote this. The immediate surround of a city was a common and open space reserved for animals and for other amenities of the lives of the citizens. What is here said about the Levites applies for the whole nation. The land was given as a possession for all time, so no contemporary generation may turn fields into common or common into field or into town. We must respect the rights of others and the well-being of others in all our deeds and words. The Torah places an obstacle to the growth of large cities at the expense of the surrounding country, which is otherwise so very prevalent. Not even open spaces in a city itself may be used for building. Well, he was certainly ahead of his time, wasn't he, writing that in the 1870s. And it's really interesting, I think, that green spaces and the green belt are part of our Torah. So, my concluding words. At the end of the account of creation in Genesis, it says, heaven and earth were finished, and on the seventh day, God ended the work and rested on the seventh day. The Greek translation, the Septuagint, more logically says God finished the work on the 6th day. But those who say it ended on the 7th day, what did God create on the 7th? God created rest. The Shabbat, the Sabbath day, is an integral part of that account of creation, a weekly special day in our time for the Jewish people, but here in the Torah to be read as a gift for the whole world, because we all need time off, we all need rest, we all need the weekend. And this is so important for our world today, our world of rush and excitement, yes, even in the lockdown, a world of endless noise and stress without enough quiet. Leisurely weekends do not, however, mean that we really know how to relax. We've lost a real concept of rest that we need so much. We have a great responsibility to our environment, but I think we also have a great responsibility to ourselves. And indeed, if each of us cared more for ourselves and how we live, the natural world around us would flourish more too. Thank you very much.